So welcome. What we're going to do this evening is we'll start our program, and as more people join us, we will expand the audience. And I just want to let you know that this recording will be saved so we can put it on our website. That's www.synagogue.org, and that will get probably put on within 48 hours so that anyone that didn't see it can view it. So I want to let me begin introductions as we've come to about 7:30. And this is our time. People will join us, I'm sure, because everyone's clock is not set quite the same. So I'm Bob Smolin from Temple Israel, and I'm going to be kind of the host this evening in the Temple Israel Talks. And I'm going to welcome this evening Jon Moscow, who is from the Northern New Jersey Sanctuary Coalition as the co-chair, and Ruby Cribbin, who is a board member from the coalition. And both of them are going to share information about the works of the Northern New Jersey Sanctuary Coalition, how it came to be, what it's like, the work that they do. And they have a presentation they'd like to share with us. If anybody has questions, they can put them in chat or they can save them to the end. And we'll ask people to mute their screens for the moment, allowing Jon and Ruby to share that information. So we'll all be a little better educated as a result of learning more about what the Northern New Jersey Sanctuary Coalition does and how it helps political asylees or asylum seekers from around the world, not just from the southern border, but anyone trying to seek asylum, and how that works and what they do to help and how they deal with the law enforcement of our country in ways that make us better. So I want to welcome everyone and say, Jon and Ruby, good evening. And I'm going to turn it over to you guys to share the information.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting us. And we've prepared a short PowerPoint, but we're not going to be asking people to sort of sit there and read long things on slides. And we're going to split the first half hour or so.
Jon, I lost your.
Yep, turned out I was on. So I'll just thank you very much for inviting us. And Ruby and I are going to share the first half hour in speaking, and then looking forward to question and answer and discussion. And I know that it's scheduled for an hour. If people want to continue it past then, we've both left time to do that. So with that, I will bring up our PowerPoint and I will turn it over to Ruby.
Well, good evening. I join with Jon in welcoming you. In the years that I've been visiting with First Friends and been on the board of Northern New Jersey Sanctuary Coalition, it's become clearer and clearer to me that the more people who know about our immigration system, the better chance we have of changing it. Earlier today, I was on a webinar with a group at the southern border. And when I came off the webinar, I just took a few minutes to think about and reflect on what had just happened. And the question that came to me was, why do we do this? Immigration really at this point is quite messy. Why do we do this? And a line came to me. It's a favorite line of mine. It's from an Irish poet. And he says, we live in the shelter of each other. We live in the shelter of each other. And I would say it's that kind of understanding that motivates me in my work with the immigration community. That sense of that we are all connected, and that because of that, we really have a responsibility, I would say, for care and concern and support of each other. So I'm going to just take a few minutes to talk about Sanctuary Coalition and start with our name, Sanctuary. When I joined the board about 5 or so years ago, I remember wondering about that title. And when Joe Schuman, our founder, talked about the history of the coalition, I realized that our title is really rooted in the sanctuary movements of the 70s and 80s, except that for us, sanctuary is not a location. It's not a synagogue or a church or a mosque or a safe house. It is rather a community of people, a community of support and a community of care, a community of relationships. And I think that's important. We are of a size small enough that we can keep that as our value and our motivation. We really are not volunteers. We're not staff people, but we are people who want to accompany those who have been granted asylum or who are seeking asylum in a new country and trying to find a life here. We are also a coalition. So if you look at John, the next slide, the number of organizations who are coalition members. If you are a coalition member of Sanctuary, that means you may have up to 2 members on our board. We also have a few board members who are independent. But what it does for us is it creates communities. In addition to the larger communities, here are 10 communities of people who, when we reach out for support and services for our clients, these are people who are there to help us, support us as we support them. Our mission is quite simple. It is, as I said, to support individuals who have applied for asylum and been released from federal detention, and for other selected asylum seekers and asylees. And it's also to advocate on issues impacting asylum seekers. When we try to support, as I said, we do that through a series of services. And I know, once again, as somebody who doesn't live in Bergen County, I was just amazed. So many of our board members are. They not only bring skill, expertise, and experience, but they bring a very tight connection to the community. And that is of enormous help when we try to reach out for support for our clients. Initially, before COVID, one of the core foundational service that we offer is right there in that slide. Housing is a human need. I think the Sanctuary Coalition is one maybe of the only organizations in this area who offer housing to asylum seekers. Some do offer housing to refugees, but I haven't found any who offer to asylum seekers. And you know, living in the metropolitan area, how difficult trying to find housing is, especially for people who are starting out new. So it's a great service that we offer. Before COVID, housing was offered in the home of an individual or of a family. And that was a wonderful opportunity to really come to know the United States through the lives of the people you were living with. As COVID came, just like everybody else, there were changes in our lives and there was changes in the organization. So now we basically offer housing by helping our clients find affordable apartments and also by paying part of their rent. These services here, if you can show the next slide, John, go to people who have come from all of these kinds of countries. And because of that, the services we have to offer have to be very individual. They have to be geared. And as I said, because we are small in number, we are able to be with our clients, our friends, and find out what they might need because of the unique countries they come from, the cultures they come from, their family stories, their personal stories, also their religious background, their educational background or lack of background, their socioeconomic status, medical history, psychological history, all of that influences the services. But it could be something as simple for us as one of our young men saved and bought a car because he needed it to get to work. But when the board member found out what the interest was that he was paying for this car, realized it was totally unrealistic and perhaps quite high for our standards. And so went with our client to negotiate with the car dealer to ensure that something more realistic could come in terms of paying off that loan. Or a single mother with a daughter. The daughter was 11. She was having dental problems. She had never been to a dentist in her life. And the board member then finds a dentist who is willing to do that dental work pro bono. Sometimes it's a client who wants to take a job training course because that will help them in the job that they have. And the board then decides if they can help to pay that course. Sometimes, as I said, it's looking for an affordable apartment and negotiating for that. Sometimes it's just the plain bureaucracy. People coming from smaller towns are not used to the kind of bureaucracy that we're used to here in the United States. And so because of that, I was just visiting the other day, and on the table in front of me was truly a stack of papers. And I just thought, I went through in about 4 or 5 different agencies contacting the family. All of them except one page were in English. And this is a family for whom English is not yet a language that they have known. And I just think it's something that we take for granted, but that for a person coming new to the country, they need someone to walk with them, to accompany them, to help them to understand. And sometimes the service is as simple as the personal things that haven't happened in their lives. A parent or a grandparent in their home country that gets sick or dies, and the grief that they go through, not being able to be there to suffer with the family. And sometimes it's a joy, a baby being born or a wedding. And again, the only way they can share that is through their phones. And so we're there trying to, as I said, accompany them and be with them. But our services are many, and I think it is because of the connections that our board members have that we are so often able to really link the need of the client with the service that can be happening. So I'm going to turn this over to Jon now to continue.
Thanks, Ruby. Yeah, so want to show a few slides of people that we've worked with and illustrating what Ruby's been talking about with relationships, and then mention a few of the people that we're working with currently. This was as it says, a single mother from Congo, Brazzaville, and who went through a lot of stuff, both coming to the United States and then once she was here, and the coalition was able to be of support for her and help her to graduate and be able to move forward with a career. And here is a young man who needed a car, and we were able to help him get an affordable car, which one of the board members had access to, and then also helped him through the bureaucracy of getting the license, the plates, and all of that kind of stuff. Here's Joe Truman, who Ruby mentioned, who is, until very recently, was the leader of the Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County, and he was the founder of the organization, and he then went and recruited other congregations and organizations to join with him. And he hosted a Syrian family in his home for about 3 years. And most of the people who have been in a host kind of situation have been single people, because obviously it's much easier to sort of integrate into a family. However, this was a family that actually was able to stay with Joe for several years. And as with many of the people that we've worked with, the relationships have continued long after the specific hosting was concerned. And this is actually two men that we're working with right now, friends, clients, both of whom are Cuban. They didn't know each other. They met through us, but they had both had to leave Cuba for getting in political trouble. And they both were staying with hosts. And then during COVID, because they had to go out and work, and that was potentially putting the host families, some of whom were vulnerable for health, in jeopardy, we helped them find an apartment, which they decided they would share. We helped negotiate with the landlord, who turned out to be quite open to it, but as in most other cases, people didn't have any, credit histories in the United States, and didn't have any of the kinds of things that landlords normally look for, and didn't have the money for, security, first and last month's rent, all of those kinds of things. And they are both still living in the apartment. In actually some cousins of one of the men came, and they had no place to stay, so they are now staying with them. And we talked to the landlord, and the landlord was fine. This was a case where, as it says here, that a host who was in his 90s called us and said that his wife had died several years before, and he was lonely. And was there somebody who was interested in living with him? And so they formed a relationship, which again lasted until shortly before the host died. But the young man has stayed in touch with his family, and has stayed in touch with the coalition. And we, as Ruby mentioned, we are about 2.5 years ago, we had a retreat, and we decided that we needed to become more active in advocacy, not only for our individual clients, but on a systemic basis. And Ruby and I will both be talking about this later. But this was a recent demonstration on Human Rights Day in December 8th, I think it was, I'm not sure, of this last year. And this is at the Elizabeth Detention Center, which is the only remaining detention center in New Jersey. We were very active, along with groups like Pax Christi and First Friends of New Jersey and New York, in getting the Bergen jail shut as a detention center. And we're now active in the Interfaith Campaign for Just Closures, which is part of the National Detention Watch Network movement to close all ICE centers. Because if you just close one, they'll try to move people someplace else. And this is just a picture of, this was a pre-COVID annual dinner. I will turn this back over to Ruby.
Thanks, John. Would you go back to the slide on the Elizabeth Detention Center, please? This center actually was opened in 1995. It was a warehouse, and it looks like a warehouse. After 2 years, there were so many, there was actually a demonstration and a riot inside, and it was turned over to a for-profit prison organization called Core Civic. Core Civic is the second largest for-profit prison operator in the United States. This particular facility they do not own, but they do operate. When this new administration came into office, they said that there would be no more contracts made with ICE, with for-profit institutions or prisons. However, They only gave that for the Department of Justice. It did not apply to the Department of Homeland Security. So right now in our country, we have over 200 facilities to detain immigrants, and that number is growing. Of those 200, 79% are owned and or operated by for-profit organizations. As John said, when the 3 county jails in New Jersey, Hudson, Essex, and Bergen, ended their contract with ICE, and we had a lot to do with that, not just us, but the immigration organizations. They really didn't do it because they changed their minds and hearts. They ended their ICE contracts because all 3 county jails all found other sources of revenue to take the place of the revenue they were receiving from detaining immigrants. And so I think I just want to be clear, immigration is a money-making business in every country throughout the world, not just here in the United States. As we closed places in New Jersey, they opened in Pennsylvania. Let me see. 2 weeks ago, 2 days ago, they got permission to expand a facility in Mushanon, Pennsylvania, and it will now be a 1,900-bed facility. It is already filled with 600 beds, which is the most that they can have now during COVID. The people in Pennsylvania worked to have the Berks Detention Center closed because there were so many violations, sexual assaults, violence. It was closed down for about 3 months and then reopened now to detain women immigrants. And just 2 days ago in Georgia, they gained permission to expand the facility to 3,081 beds. I think the saddest part of this story is that the people in Georgia and Pennsylvania went to the open meeting to protest against opening or expanding these facilities, said that every person in the community who spoke in favor of having these prisons did so because of jobs. I think that says a lot about us as a country, a lot about our approach to immigration detention and detention in general. When people depend for their lives on jobs, that will incarcerate others. The other thing I just want to talk about is what happens to our clients and to anybody who is in the asylum process. Right now, when this administration came into power, or whatever you call it, into office, I guess is a better word, they really inherited an immigration system that had been totally deconstructed. Right now, we have 1.6 million cases pending in immigration courts. It will take 4 years to process those cases, 4 years. Now that trickles down to everybody. I'm dealing with a Haitian family who I hope will soon become our clients. They are applying for temporary protections status because they are Haitian. They have that. That's a 6-month thing that can be renewed. They were told it will take 8 months to a year to process that. Once they receive temporary protection status, then they can apply for working authorization. And that can take 6 months to a year. That means for this family, for up to 2 years, they will have no way legally to have income. They may get food from the food pantry, they may get clothing from the thrift store, but they have no way to pay rent. They have no way to pay diapers for their children. They have no way to pay the utilities. And it's simply because the system is so backlogged. We had an example of this at our recent board meeting when one of our friends had to reapply for work authorization. He did send his papers in and probably would have made the 6-month cutoff, except as one of our board members investigated, they got lost on somebody's desk, which will mean he will probably have several months of a gap when he will have no ability to really work legally. And these gaps are in everything. And it's simply where the system is at this point in time. And with the new influx of Afghan refugees, this has even more put a stress on the system and people wanting to process, and yet the time lag is always there. John, stop me because I can go on forever. The last thing I would want to talk about is the culture of ICE. ICE is Immigration, Custom Enforcement. And when you work with organizations, you know you cannot change a culture. You can't militarize a culture. You can't demonize people in a culture and then the next day say everything's going to change. And right now we have a culture in ICE that has not changed, as John alluded to earlier. Many things are being said nicely, but they're not filtering down to the ground where life happens. We have a young man who came to this country years ago. As a young man, he applied and got a green card. His green card is eligible to 2028. He married, he has 4 children. One of the children is a special need child. He did get into trouble. It had something to do with credit cards. The judge who judged on the case, looked at all of the evidence, did not feel that his crime was such that he had to be incarcerated. So she put him on probation for 2 years. But ICE came and said, because you are on probation, we can detain you. He has now been in detention over 3 years. Not only does his wife and 4 children depend on him, his parents, who fled their home country as he did, depends on him. And he was putting a brother-in-law through school, depending on him. All of that is gone. In November, this administration put out new guidelines about a detention according to the kind of crime you have committed. This young man did not commit a serious crime. He is not in any way a danger to the community. He is not a flight asset, and yet ICE will not release him. We have tried, not just the coalition, but the coalition in relationship to groups we work with. We have been trying for about 5 months. We have gone in many different ways, seeing if he could be released. According to the guidelines, he should be released, but he is not. So that's just one example. John, why don't you pick up, or I'll get...
Okay, well, let me just give a couple more quick examples fitting in with what Ruby said, and then I'd like to talk about some of the things, some of the advocacy things that we're working on that hopefully can make a systemic difference. 2 of the clients that we're working with have been both victims of ICE and of the delays. So, for example, I'll use the initial K, is a survivor of domestic violence and the mother of 2 girls. And she's from the Dominican Republic, and she's applying for a green card under the Violence Against Women Act. And she was arrested by ICE in front of her daughters and was separate. The daughters are 8 and 16, and she was separated from them for 4 months until she was released from detention on bail. And it turns out that the case against her has now been completely dismissed, but she and her daughters are traumatized. And it turns out that while she had a work permit and she applied in plenty of time for renewal of the work permit, it expired before the papers came through, she had been hired for a job and then the company couldn't keep her because she didn't have the papers. And so she's now unemployed and is in the situation Ruby described, where the family has no, I mean, the coalition is providing support, but that doesn't go, far enough to support a family of 3. And similarly, a couple who had to leave Honduras when the husband was severely beaten and threatened with death by gangs associated with the government. And he came with his then 6-year-old daughter, and they were separated at the border for 3 months and 10 days. And then they were finally released, and the mother and a younger son were able to come, and they didn't have difficulty getting in. And we've been able to help support them. They're living in New Brunswick at this point, but their cases are not scheduled. I don't think they even know when their hearings are scheduled for, but they're certainly not before 2023. And this has been hanging over them since at least 2019. And again, they're traumatized. Imagine being separated from your 6-year-old daughter for 3 months and not having any idea of what's going to happen either to you or to her. And then imagine it from her perspective, from the daughter's perspective.
John, can I say one thing before you go
Sure.
to what they can do?
Sure.
One piece of good news, since I just heard today that this administration is initiating a pilot program for 120 families. And what they're calling it house arrest. Unfortunately, they're using the term arrest, but that people will stay in their homes. They will have to be there from 8:30 at night, 8 o'clock at night until 8 o'clock the next morning, which would allow them to go to work. And it's very interesting. This program will cost $6 a person, whereas when people are detained, it can cost between $110 a day to, I just learned, $140 a day for every person detained in immigration. So this would be not only a great saving for the government, but it certainly would allow people to work out their cases in a more humane setting. So I'm hoping that this pilot program could be successful. It's one of the alternatives to detention that are being worked on right now.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks for adding that. So I want to mention a couple of things that we're doing, but I want to do it very briefly because we do want to leave time for general discussion, and we can certainly discuss these things in more depth. Our basic feeling, and that of a number of other organizations, is that this has to be addressed systemically at the same time that we're also working with individuals. And so there's 2 bills, one in New Jersey and one in Congress. The one in New Jersey is called the Values Act, and it has a Senate number 4289 and an Assembly number 6222. And what it will basically do is to put into law what the Attorney General had done as an
I
don't think that's me.
It sounds
Anyway, okay. What it does is it puts into law some of the protections to try to make sure that people can live their lives safely and can do fundamental things like, for example, going to courts and things without fear of being picked up by ICE, and that local police will end up expanding ICE's grasp. And we'll be glad to give you some of the details of this if people would like more details. But this is something that's being sponsored by a broad coalition of advocacy groups, and that we're hoping to see some action on in this term of the legislature. And then the other one is called A New Way Forward, which is House Resolution 536 nationally, which has been introduced by about 45, I think, sponsors. And national groups are now actually hoping that Senator Booker would be interested in co-sponsoring it in the Senate. And one of the things this would do would be to decriminalize immigration, which is not to say that there still wouldn't be lots of procedures people have to go through. But the whole idea of being an immigrant being criminalized is a recent thing. And it's not something that sort of goes back forever. And so this would reverse that, and it would end mandatory detention for asylum seekers with credible fear of persecution, which is the technical term that people need to pass that credible fear test, and would do a number of other things. And so we would definitely welcome people working with us on this through the Interfaith Campaign for Just Closures, which we initiated. Bob asked earlier if we were working at all with the Afghan community, and we started working with the organization Afghan Americans of New Jersey. And in fact, we're planning a joint fundraiser at the end of March, which will include somebody speaking about Afghan culture and also an Afghan musician, so that it'll be designed both for the Afghan community and the non-Afghan community. So I'll stop here so that we can have time for other people to talk, and hopefully we can answer some of your questions.
All right, thank you, John, and thank you, Ruby. We have an audience, and I welcome them to unmute if they have any questions of John or Ruby. I will start with one question and let others to jump in whenever they might like. There's a lot of things that jump out at me. I guess, first of all, is this quagmire of a process sounds so defeating that I'm not sure how people possibly sustain themselves through this. It almost gives you a desire to go back to your homeland, and unless it's worse, which is probably the case, and you have to put up with it. Is this quagmire so overwhelming that you find these people, just beside themselves and frustrated and crippled? Is this what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I would just begin by saying for Sanctuary, we ask our clients that they have a lawyer. No one can ever get through this process without a lawyer. It's just not possible. Even to get out of detention without a lawyer is almost, I think it's 2% make it. But that would be a beginning. I think the second thing is there is not necessarily consistency. We've had people who in detention, and you understand that if you come to apply for asylum, you are put in detention. We've had people in detention with the same type of cases, with the same appeals being made, and one judge saying yes and one judge saying no. And I think we have to be honest that during the last administration, many new judges came into the immigration system that were never immigration judges. That was not their field of study. And so there's a difficulty there. I'll just say those two things. John, do you want to add anything more?
I'll just say that, a lot depends, as with everything else, unfortunately, on what resources you come with. And people who have either, do have some money or do have, contacts and resources and the ability to get a lawyer, which can mean the ability to come to the attention of, nonprofit legal defense, or if you can afford an attorney, you have an easier time if you have resources. It's obviously, the description you were giving, Bob, is absolutely true for many people. And then again, as Ruby says, it varies. For example, one family whom she mentioned, who are Haitian, who had been in Chile and then have a daughter with severe disabilities and were unable to get any kind of medical or other kind of help for her because of discrimination and prejudice against Haitians in Chile. They managed to make it to the border. They were turned away at the border, and people told them, you're never going to get through. And so they decided to wade through the Rio Grande, and they did. But in the process, the daughter with a disability ended up, the current was so strong, she ended up with a broken pelvis. And they made it to the shore, and they were apprehended by border control. And fortunately, the border officers happened to be decent people. And instead of, simply forcing them back into Mexico, they helped them get to one of the nonprofits that help people around the border. And they were eventually able to get referred up to where their family was in Irvington. However, unfortunately, the family then put them out on the street after 2 weeks, and they ended up living on the streets until they were lucky enough to be able to make a connection with a Haitian church, and then eventually into sort of the totally dysfunctional system that Ruby in particular has been trying to help them get through to get their kids in school, get their kids vaccinated. And I'm not even talking just about COVID vaccination, but any kind of vaccinations, and get them into the medical system. And in this particular case, the schools and the hospital system are willing and eager to help, but there are still all sorts of obstacles.
I'd also say that in my visitation, in visiting people in detention, I have had 3 people who took what we call self-deportation. One was a mother who came with her husband 10 years ago. They lived in the United States in Connecticut for 10 years. They both had jobs without working papers or without documentation. They were told that in the country they came from, and I can say it, Colombia, that things were better now, that they could go back home. Now they had 2 children. They returned home, and as soon as they returned home, within 2 years, the same thing happened. People coming, demanding bribery. They had a small store. You need protection for your store. Your son should join our gang. And they were so traumatized that they had a plan that the mother would come back first to the United States, and then her children, and then her husband. And when she came to the JFK with her visa from Colombia, she was arrested. She could not understand during the 6 months she was in detention why she was arrested. She didn't understand that they had overstood their visa the first time, and therefore coming back into the country, they would be arrested. So she was in Elizabeth, actually, and her husband just could not handle the 2 boys and work. And so she said in desperation, I have to go home. I know it's crazy, but I have to go back because I have to take care of my children. Another person who took self-deportation was a young woman from a Caribbean country. And she just said to me, I have been in detention 3.5 years. I have had my 2 appeals rejected. Why would they ever say yes to my 3rd appeal? Because you're allowed to appeal 3 times. The reason it takes so long between the appeals is what we said before. It's not like you have an appeal and then it gets rejected and you can appeal again. It can be 18 months. It can be a year in between. Nothing happens in detention. Nothing. There are 2 television sets, one in English, one in Spanish. There is a law library, but only a law library. There is a computer where you can only use it for your law case. And there are 3 telephones that you can use as you stand in line. That's it, all day long, 24 hours a day. And this is what drives people really psychologically, because they're worried about their family, they're worried about their case. So this young woman just said, I just can't take it. And I talked to her a long time, but people have to do what they have to do. And she went back, as I said, to a Caribbean country where we think it's so wonderful, and we go there on vacation, and we don't realize up in the mountains, there is nothing. That's what she says to me every day, every week when she calls. There is nothing here. I cannot, and her English is perfect, reads and writes it perfectly. I thought perhaps she could get the job in the tourist agency, but she can't afford to live in that part of the country. And then the 3rd one was a young man who went back because he just said, if this is the way you treat people in the United States, I don't want to live here. So I have had 3 people who did take deportation, self-deportation.
Wow, just amazing. And so let me understand that the Sanctuary Coalition, you receive people after they've been released so that, and they're trying to make their way, but you can't really put your hands on people that are in detention. Is that correct?
The only thing I visited in detention as a member of First Friends.
Uh-huh.
But you're right about the people that the Sanctuary Coalition works with right now are either people who have been granted asylum or are in asylum seekers. They're in the process.
And some of those, in fact, have, as I was mentioning, have been released from detention. Sometimes people will come in through the airport or someplace like that, and will be fortunate enough not to be put in detention. Again, it's very haphazard, but we do have some people, some clients who have not been in detention, but most have. And the reason that we, ask that people have a lawyer is, and that they have applied for asylum, is simply in terms, because we are an all-volunteer organization, and we have a very small budget, and we had to essentially say, okay, how can we, given our resources, be most effective? And so that's why we have that requirement for actually becoming a client. However, we work with a number of people who don't fit that that criterion, but we just help, we do it as individuals instead. And the organization, supports doing it as individuals. And then, as that was another reason that we felt it was critical to become more active in advocacy, so that we are now joining in the advocacy for people who have been in, who are currently in detention, people who are currently being threatened with deportation, and also, as I mentioned, systemically.
What was the number that you mentioned? I think you mentioned earlier, the number of people that are in detention in the United States?
I didn't mention it. I said there are 1.6 million cases pending. Right now, I just heard that, just give me a minute. I think, if I'm correct, I think there are only 205,000 in detention right now. And that number has gone down because of COVID. We used to have 2,500 just here in New Jersey, but 250,000, I'm sorry, in the country right now. I don't think it's clear to people, particularly from what you hear on the media, that since May of 2020, our borders have been closed. John referred to it earlier, under Title 42. No one can enter the United States coming from a country that has a communicable disease. So what is happening is people are coming to the border and immediately being expelled. But they're not going to go back home. And so, as the family that John talked about, they take to the river. And if you cross the river and are picked up by the borders guards, you are processed under remain in Mexico. So you're given a number, you're sent back to Mexico, but you're at least in the process. So the only people coming into the United States right now are unaccompanied minors. Those are the ones coming in. After the new administration came in and they repealed Title 42 before the Texas court took them to court and said they couldn't do it, every day 300 families were processed of people who had been remaining in Mexico 2-3 years. They were processed in. But once the Texas court took the government to court about that, that stopped also. So anybody coming in now is coming in and being expelled the border. And all that is doing is giving the coyotes more money. Last year, 550,000 people crossed the river. The coyotes charge them $1,000 for every person crossing the river. And as my friend at the border said, you don't want to see what happens to the ones who don't pay the $1,000. So the southern border is a mess, and right now the northern border isn't going to be too much better. But we have to be people with hope.
And you need a lot of it. It's a pretty frightening situation, desperate and depressing. I have to say that's really an extraordinary struggle. You guys
But
mentioned
there are
about
so many people, Bob. There's so many people working against that.
That's good.
where you
That's
get your
good to know.
knowledge from. Yes.
You also mentioned about money, that the deportation centers or some of the private, not or for profit prison people, who is paying this? Is this the U.S. government covering these expenses?
Absolutely.
You mean you're talking about who is paying for the detention?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, for example, when ICE had the detention center at the Bergen jail, the government had a contract where they were paying X amount per night, as Ruby was talking about, per bed. And then when there was sufficient pressure from advocacy groups and it got embarrassing because you had all of these, Democratic,
Liberal.
commissioners and mayors and Democratic Party leaders and all these people who had been talking about how terrible the Trump administration was. And they were busy continuing to implement these policies. And at a certain point, it became really embarrassing. And so they worked out deals where they were able to incarcerate other people in the jails. For example, in Bergen, I believe that I think they worked something out with Passaic County, and I think also with other federal prisoners. But I know that Passaic, I see you shaking your head, Ruby. I know that there's been discussion of Passaic and Bergen. That may not have gone into effect yet.
But the other two did, county ones. So yes, the government pays to incarcerate. In New Jersey, it was somewhere between $110 and $120 a day for every person, every immigrant who was detained. I just learned this morning that at the southern border, it can be as much as $140 a day for every person incarcerated. So that adds up.
Wow. Anyone else have a question? Feel free to unmute and speak right up so that I'm not doing the sole discussion. I welcome anyone else with their questions. You guys are doing amazing work. You wanted to, you said as a coalition, there are others that you are interacting with. Could you share some of the other organizations you interact with in this coalition?
Yeah, we work the Interfaith Campaign for Just Closures, and the Just Closures was in terms of focusing on closing the detention centers in Jersey, but doing it in a just manner, which meant releasing people rather than transferring them. And we were able to get some people released, which is interesting because the sheriff had been telling us that it was only the most dangerous people who were at Bergen. And we knew this wasn't the case. And in fact, they did in fact release some people who obviously had somehow gone from being the most dangerous people to not being the most dangerous people. Other people they did transfer, especially to Batavia, which is up by Buffalo, or to Goshen in Orange County. The Interfaith Campaign, the primary other members are Pax Christi and First Friends of New Jersey and New York. In terms of other groups that are, that we work with closely, American Friends Service Committee. We're a member of the New Jersey Alliance for Immigrant Justice, which is an alliance of about 50 organizations, which primarily focuses on legislation in New Jersey legislation. And they've been the primary organizations that have been working on getting the Values Act introduced, and things that people from the congregations can do to be helpful. There's strong need for grassroots support for the Values Act, which can be people contacting their legislators. It can be people writing letters to the editor. It can be people urging towns to take positions. Similarly, there's a need with a new way forward to be urging Congress people to sign on. I know from New Jersey, Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman has signed on. We're hoping that other people will. And as I mentioned, we're hoping that Senator Booker will introduce it into the Senate. We are going to be having activities, vigils and demonstrations in March. I know one is going to be, there's been for a number of years actions on Ash Wednesday, which of course is, predominantly, my sense is a Catholic holiday. However, the events have been interdenominational and interreligious. And that's going to be focusing this year on Ash Wednesday, which I believe is March 2nd, 2nd or 3rd. I'm not positive. It's a Wednesday, obviously.
Second.
And that's going to involve starting out in Elizabeth and having some ceremonies there, and going to visit Senators Menendez and Booker and Congressman Ruby
Payne.
right, who has been helpful in stopping some of or delaying some of the deportations. And then we're going to be having some interfaith actions later in the month, which we would welcome. We can let people know when they're going to be. We'd love people's help. We'd love it if people would be interested in participating in the interfaith campaign. And if the congregations are interested in considering becoming members as congregations of the Sanctuary Coalition, we would love that. Basically, we ask that there be either 1 or 2 representatives who come to one monthly meeting. It's been Zoom meetings, obviously, for the last couple of years. And then we have committees, but the level of individual involvement can be as great as people would like, or it can be simply, participating and getting the word back out to members of the congregation.
All right.
And
Donations, monetary donations are obviously always helpful.
Sure.
And also we put out calls for supplies a lot of times, because that's what people need a lot. If like when we mentioned that we'd help people get an apartment, the apartment's there, but there's no furniture,
Right.
anything.
Well, feel free to email me and see if I can rally if you need those kind of materials or support for someone. I'd be happy to advocate for that.
thank you.
So I'm hearing no further questions, and I'm not trying to monopolize. I've learned
could I just
Gloria?
mention something?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure, Gloria,
Thank
go.
you very much. I really do appreciate what you are doing, and I know how frustrating it must be. We had a lawyer from Hayas on several months ago, and she voiced similar issues that you have. But she and many lawyers are voluntarily, trying to help, but it's like a quagmire, And I did once go to a rally outside of the Elizabeth detention building, so I kind of know about that. So maybe someone could write down the legislation, and so that we have the numbers, and we can maybe email our senators and our representatives, and be a little more knowledgeable of what we can say in our email. That I think that would help. And and where donations would go, that would help too. We do have a social action committee at the temple, so if you had,
Please pass that along to me. I'll make sure it gets to the social action committee and make sure it gets some publicity.
And I'm putting,
Also,
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, I'm putting the
Good.
information on the Values Act and the a new way forward into the chat.
And also on February 23rd, I think it is, yes, next, Northern New Jersey Sanctuary Coalition is having Carlos Rojas Rodriguez talk on a new way forward, and you're all invited. If you want to join that at 7 o'clock, just give John your email. He is the national coordinator with Detention Watch Network for this bill, A New Way Forward. So if you'd like to learn about that, it will be 40 minutes. It's a half-hour presentation, and then 10 to 15 minutes of questions and answers. So just see that John gets your email if you would like to join that. I think it will be very informative.
And I just wanted to say in terms of HIAS, that actually one of the clients whom we were able to help, my wife and I hosted her for a year, came through HIAS, and that probably had a lot to do with why she was not initially in detention and never had to be in detention. And yeah, they do really good work.
Yeah, right. I'm glad to hear that. Right.
Feel free to send me that information using my email address you have, and I will share that information with the whole community as I share my report in the Temple Talk print edition. So we'll be able to share that information.
And we have, and I'm also typing out very slowly about where contributions to the Sanctuary Coalition can be made. We have a website, so you can go there and get that information. I think it's NNJ Coalition. Excuse me, but I'm also writing it out for the address.
Okay, well, please send that, as I said, to
Yeah,
me so I can
right.
get that out to a wider network.
Right.
That would be great. Well, you guys, as I had hoped, shared a tremendous amount of information, and certainly I'm better informed than I was before we started, and delighted that I was able to make a connection with you both, Ruby and John, and you're doing amazing things, and I'm certainly in support of your efforts. In this world, every step forward and every person you help strengthens us all, and it's really terrific. So please keep that up. I'll be happy to share this information. Our program tonight is part of a social action effort, which I felt was necessary to share with our community. And I'm glad that you were a part of it in making this social justice where we can better help our fellow human beings in this amazing struggle and in the quagmire that they're facing. And recognizing the underlying elements of all this is this poverty and corruption and horrific living situations people around the world live in as they try to flee to have a better life, which is such a struggle.
Thank you very much.
Well,
Thank you.
Good luck in the future.
Thank
All
you.
right, so I'm
for
going to
having
wish
us.
everyone a pleasant evening. Stay warm. Hopefully the temperature will get a little better and warmer, and maybe spring won't be too far around the corner. I don't know if Punxsutawney Phil was right or not. Let's hope that it gets a little better and brighter, and continued good work for both you and Ruby as the board member and John as the co-director there, and it's really appreciated. So thank you again for this great evening, and I'll make sure that it gets on our website, and I look forward to being in touch with you.
Thank you.
Bob.
Take
All
care.
right, thanks very much. Have a great
Thank
night.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.